I sued the Department of the Interior yesterday for not responding to my FOIA requests over the last few months. You know,
That felt good.
It felt, now there's a Clement B. Zinke lawsuit out there. I feel pretty satisfied, but you know, that is a really, really important tool that we can't forget. It's meant to be to increase transparency. It's the law. And what we're finding is they are not responding to these FOIA requests, even though it's a huge drag to do. We all had to do it when we were in the agencies, but we did it, and we generated those products, and now they're not doing it at all. And just in connection to my case and the mass reassignment of as many as 50 senior executives, they haven't released a single document, and there have been dozens of FOIA requests about that incident alone, and that's why I'm suing.
Good evening. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, live in Harvard Square, and thank you for joining us for this most timely of topics, the war against science. Tonight's program comes on the heels of the latest UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany, and it promises to be a valuable evening for information and hopefully optimism. I'm Mary Stack, the director of the Cambridge Forum, and we are most fortunate to have as our guest speaker tonight a scientist who's come directly from Bonn, Joel Clement. Joel has gained international notoriety of late as the newest Washington whistleblower. He resigned very publicly last July from the Trump Department of the Interior, where he was director of the policy office. Clement wrote a very honest first-person piece in the Washington Post, where he stated he could no longer work for someone unwilling to lead on climate change that could not be trusted with our nation's natural resources. Before I introduce our main speaker, I would like you to meet our discussion panel, and they are Professor Kurt Spalding from Brown University's Institute of the Environment. He is a former EPA official for Region 1 in the Obama administration, and Dr. Andrew Rosenberg, Director for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our moderator today is Dr. Tim Weiskeli, an anthropologist and historian and founder of Cambridge Climate Research Associates. So thank you all for joining us. Joel Clement is going to tell you his own story in his own words. But before he begins, I would just like to make a brief preface. What happened to Joel Clement is indicative of a much bigger threat to democracy that is happening in our country right now. The gagging of public information is unlawful in America, and in this particular instance, scientists have become the first victim of the assault on information. Deliberately disabling an agency is a dangerous precedent. This is what Joel Clement wrote earlier in the year. Suppressing the truth, of course, is not new, and neither is having a witch hunt. Back in the 50s, it was the communists who were ferreted out, and now it's climate change activists that are being coerced into silence. So far, they have not succeeded, and if tonight is any gauge, it has merely fueled the determination of the opposition. So without further ado, let me introduce Joel Clement.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And I'm delighted to be here at the Cambridge Forum to talk about my experiences with the Trump administration's misbehaviors and the war against science. I'm generally not a fan of the war metaphors. The war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on coal, which was a made-up war to describe something that was just a natural market trend away from the more high-priced coal to the cheaper natural gas. So sometimes the war metaphors aren't apt, but in this case, I have to say, no matter how you describe it, marginalizing and overcoming science is absolutely a top priority for the Trump administration. I've experienced that firsthand, and others have talked about it. On September 9th this year, actually, the New York Times published an editorial, and I think it was actually called Trump's War on Science, talking about this issue, and I Googled quickly, a quick Google search, and there are dozens of books out there that talk about different elements of this anti-intellectual work, and a few of them, The War on Science, The Death of Expertise, Not a Scientist. These are all books. Naomi Oreskes wrote The Merchants of Doubt, Michael Mann's The Madhouse Effect, Chris Mooney wrote The Republican War on Science. So there's a lot out there, right? And it's been going on for a long time, but I'm just going to go ahead and say the Trump administration has taken anti-intellectualism to a new low. And it's taken hold in new ways because it's being seized upon as the best way to get government out of the way for industry and special interests. So you'll be hearing from my fellow esteemed panelists on this subject a little later, but for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk about my story, what's going on at the Department of the Interior, and how I became a federal whistleblower. Then I'm going to recite some poetry, and then I'm going to bring you some good news from the UN Climate Conference in Bonn that I just returned from. And for those of you that think you just maybe heard that wrong, I mentioned good news and climate change in the same sentence. So let's see how that goes toward the end of the talk. But first I wanted to get a sense of who's in the audience. How many of you are scientists or experts in your field? Several. Okay, quite a few. All right. How many are journalists or writers out here? Great. I have to say I've had a lot of experience with the media for the last few months, and I am just incredibly impressed with journalists out there right now. Such an important field, doing great work. There's a lot of noise, of course, but some really impressive stuff. So props to you guys. Okay, how many students in the room? Okay, we have a couple students. And then just generally concerned citizens, would you say? Okay, a lot of hands. Anyone here from Maine? Darn it. Okay. As a Mainer in Massachusetts, I just like to know where my people are. But and then I yell out Dirigo, which is the Maine motto. And the Maine state motto is referring to, it means I lead, and it's referring to the North Star on the Maine seal. And it tends to be very apt for talks I give because I consider science to be the North Star for policy, or it should be, right? And so I speak of them interchangeably quite a lot, and you'll see that in this talk. And it's clear, of course, the Trump administration has veered way off course in regards to that North Star. So, so here's my story, what's happening in Interior, what has happened there. Until July, as Mary mentioned, I was director of the policy office at the Department of the Interior. I was also the climate change lead at that agency. Climate change, and particularly adaptation and resilience, are incredibly important for all the bureaus of the Department of the Interior. For all of our missions, from managing those legendary national parks to protecting biodiversity, producing world-class science at U.S. Geological Survey, and managing, the DOI manages a fifth of the U.S. land area for multiple uses on behalf of all Americans. So climate change, absolutely essential to all of those bureaus. I worked hard on that, and I spoke very publicly about it in many fora to the public, and particularly as it related to the Arctic, where I was focused, where there are American lives at risk as the permafrost is melting away from beneath their feet, and waves and storms are devouring meters of coastline at a time, threatening dozens of Alaska Native villages up there. So it's a very urgent situation. And as many of you may know, the Department of the Interior is also the federal trustee for American Indians and Alaska Natives. So their well-being is core to our mission as well. So this is very important work, not just to me and to the Alaska Natives, but to the entire agency. So after the November election, you know, as everyone was kind of freaking out about the rhetoric that had been coming out during the campaign regarding climate change, I wasn't that worried. I thought, you know, we're doing adaptation. We're responding to impacts that we can see before us. American health and safety is at risk, and we're going to continue to do that. In fact, I was in Stockholm a couple weeks later after the election, and I was reassuring some really stressed out Europeans that sure enough, resilience and adaptation would remain at the top, or at least on the agenda in the United States. And I was there for the release of the Arctic Resilience Report. It was the first ever report about how to build social ecological resilience in the Arctic. So it was the issue of the day, and I reassured them, certainly we'll still be doing that work. And of course, I feel like an idiot now for that. I had just vastly overestimated the integrity and the maturity of the incoming politicals of the Trump administration. What happened next was an all-out assault on anything that even had a whiff of climate change, a whiff of science, or anything, of course, that the previous administration had even touched. It was like being led by a gang of vindictive seventh graders. And actually, every time I talk, I drop that down. I'm thinking maybe sixth graders now, because it's just been ridiculous. Eliminate all Obama programs, marginalize science and scientists, and shrink government to allow industry fuller access. And in the case of DOI, that means taking the public lands out of the public's hands. So that three-step process, it's very simple and very cynical. We're seeing it over and over. It's a series of these ham-fisted punches at the rules and the policies and the regulations that are in place, the laws, to protect American resources and to protect American health and safety. And really the only saving grace right now is that they're just not very good at it. Right? I mean, they're clumsy and they're going to wind up in court. It's already started happening and that's going to continue to happen. So the courts are a pretty good backstop for some of this stuff. But some of those punches, as careless as many of them are, one of them at least was aimed at the Senior Executive Service at the Department of the Interior, that's the SES. Now, this is the executive corps of career professionals that was established when an agency needs high-level but non-political expertise in an area. And there are a lot of scientists and experts in this category. And they're meant to be deployed for those high-level but non-political positions. And there are about 220 of us at Interior out of about 70,000 employees at Interior. And every administration, when they come in, they move a few SCSers around. That's kind of part of the drill. But no agency in any administration has ever come in and moved 50 of us at once, with the clear intent, we believe, to dislodge many of us from the civil service entirely. And to do this, they moved people into jobs that had nothing to do with their area of expertise. Many were moved across the country. None of them were notified in advance, and none of them were given an option. There were most, I would say, had families. Many were retirement age. And it appears as though a disproportionate number of them were women and people of color. So a very erratic and surprising move on the part of DOI. And Secretary Ryan Zinke, who at the time was the only Senate-confirmed employee at DOI, was up on the Hill the very next week testifying to Congress that yes, indeed, he intended to use reassignments along with other means to reduce the DOI workforce by about 4,000 people. Now, reassignments don't reduce the workforce, right? So the only way it can is if those folks quit. And SCSers can sure be moved, even involuntarily, but it's unlawful to move employees to get them to quit. So Secretary Zinke had been essentially confessing his unlawful strategy before Congress. Also not the most clever move on his part. But at any rate, I was on their list, and they clearly really wanted me to go. I say this because they moved me, the climate change guy, to the office responsible for collecting and dispersing royalty checks from the oil and gas and mining industries, right? So they didn't, I've said before, they don't win any awards for nuance here. They made it very clear they wanted me out. Now, I really liked the people in that office. They were as surprised as I was that I was moved into that office, and they were fantastic and supportive, and they bent over backwards to try and bring me into their field as a leader. Absolutely ridiculous. This was a waste of taxpayer dollars to retrain me that way, take me out of my area of expertise into a field I know nothing about, to put these folks through the process of retraining me, waste of my background, waste of my salary, generally just bad governance. And more importantly, of course, it ended my work supporting the Alaska Natives facing climate change impacts, right? So this climate change stuff is not a policy debate for these folks. This is a matter of health and safety, and lives are at stake up there, right? So this is not, we get caught up in DC a lot about back and forth and who said what, but for these folks in the Arctic, it's a urgent matter of life and death, right? A storm could spin up in the Bering Sea at any time right now. This time of year, we all worry because there used to be pack ice that would protect these folks from these autumn and winter storms. Right now, there's no ice in sight up there. It'll come eventually, but for now, they're extremely vulnerable to storms. And the federal government, of course, is absolutely responsible for relocating these villages. It's going to take years. It takes a lot of money, but it's not going to happen overnight. But it needs to start. You need to turn up the volume. The Obama administration had been doing so, but a lot more needs to be done. And what they're getting is the opposite right now, slowing things down. So I found a great employment attorney named Katie Atkinson at Wilkenfeld Law, and I filed an official whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel. And at the same time, as Mary mentioned, I went public about it by publishing an op-ed in the Washington Post. And this made me the first whistleblower, the first public whistleblower of the Trump administration. And unfortunately, so far I'm the only one, and I hope there'll be more. We all do. But the reaction was intense and incredibly supportive. I was absolutely stunned by the kind of support I got from all across the country. Even the Senate, 8 senators wrote to the department, to the inspector general at the department, and said, you need to investigate this. This seemed inappropriate. So that investigation is actually going on now. There was a team of America's top legal scholars. I didn't know they were America's top legal scholars at the time, but I've since been told by lawyers that they are literally the top of their field in this country, and they wrote a letter to the Office of Special Counsel on my behalf saying that this move by DOI is dangerously close to politicizing the civil service, and it's important that there be a gap between the politicals and the civil service. You can't ask civil servants to take political stands. So a lot of great responses. My colleagues in the federal government as well, just really super strangers from around the country were sending messages and email. I got a pile of postcards from strangers when I finally got up the nerve to go back to work after blowing the whistle, and the folks in my new office pointed to my desk at the stack of fan mail. I was just stunned. I got goosebumps. But I often quote from Walt Disney's underappreciated brother Roy Disney. No one's ever heard of him, but he said, when values are clear, decision making is easy. And this was a no-brainer for me. It was an easy decision to make. I'd already lost my job. They'd taken my job. All I had left was my voice. So I used it. I used it again. I used it quite frequently, actually, much to the annoyance, I'm sure, of the politicals at DOI. And then last month, when it became very clear that Secretary Zinke had no respect for the mission of the agency, no respect for the career staff at the agency, and no intention of doing what the law requires and protecting people from the impacts of climate change, I used that voice once again. And I submitted my resignation letter, and that turned out to be a pretty popular document as well, and went around the internet. In that letter, I called out the crowded list of items on Zinke's resume of failure, and I asked him to resign. The following week, I published an op-ed with CNN to amplify that point, and again, asked Zinke to resign. In these documents, I described several ways that Zinke and his team were compromising science. But the most egregious example, in my opinion, was canceling a National Academy study into the health impacts of mountaintop removal coal mining. Now, the Congress had just eliminated the Waters of the United States rule that was meant to protect people from the impacts of this mining. So to then just cynically delete and cancel a study that would have demonstrated what those impacts to American health and safety were was just appalling to me. It's just so disgusting. It's a cynical disregard, I think, for American health. And of course, despite my requests, he has not resigned yet. Hopefully he will. Not done yet. But vocalizing his betrayal of DOI and the DOI mission was important to me and important to the devoted civil servants at DOI. And it continues to be one of my main messages, that the political leaders are trying to dismantle the agencies that they've been put in charge of, right? This is not only unlawful, but it's putting Americans, the American economy, and American resources at risk. And in the past few months, this summer in particular, we've seen how the stakes are getting higher, particularly with climate change. And it's not just that Hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Maria were these monster storms made worse by climate change, and they absolutely were. But the damage and suffering were multiplied exponentially by a lack of resilience planning, by deregulation on steroids, and an ongoing disregard for environmental justice. And these are all symptoms of industry's grip on our planning and regulatory bodies. So it's something we need to be very aware of. And sadly, these extreme weather events are going to continue to be intensified by climate change. The science is absolutely conclusive on that. Also, slow-moving disasters like sea level rise and coastal erosion are going to make them worse. Sadly, it'll usually be the poorest among us who suffer the most. And sadly, the Trump administration is not taking any of the measures they know they need to take to reverse these dangerous changes. So I like to, before I talk about Bonn, I like to sum up this administration with an excerpt from Gary Snyder's poem, Spell Against Demons, with apologies for the gender-specific language in the first line. The man who has the soul of the wolf knows the self-restraint of the wolf. Aimless executions and slaughterings are not the work of wolves and eagles, but the work of hysterical sheep. Right? I think it's apt. Now, what happens to the hysterical sheep when they're surrounded by lions and tigers? And this is what I found out this weekend in Bonn, Germany, where this year's UN climate conference, or COP23, took place. COP23 just means Council of the Parties. 23 means it's the 23rd year in a row that they've been negotiating on this UN framework on climate change. So this is the 23rd time they've met. It happens every year. It's a great big event for folks that work on not just climate change, but sustainable development, development in general, and many other issues, because climate change, of course, touches on so many things, environmental justice and others. This year, it's taking place at the headquarters in Bonn, because Fiji is the host, and it just wasn't practical to get everyone out to Fiji, and probably not great from the CO2 perspective as well. So they hosted in Bonn. Now, I'd been to one of these before. I went to COP21 in Paris, where they hammered out the Paris Agreement and signed the Paris Agreement. I was there with the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Sally Jewell, and it's a remarkable experience to walk into one of these things. In that case, and in many cases, it's a series of giant buildings, maybe hangars. Everything has just been built for this. And countries have pavilions. There are dozens of country pavilions that are basically meeting spaces where they do presentations and talks. So as you walk through the COP facility, you can stop and listen to someone in the India pavilion talk about sustainable development in India, or the Korean pavilion, South Korean pavilion, talking about fisheries. I mean, it's just a vast array of topics, and every country really steps up, sets up a brilliant pavilion, and they do a lot of great work. When I was there in Paris, I was there to talk about Arctic resilience issues, and I put together a session for our secretary to participate in about climate adaptation in the Arctic, but also in the Pacific Islands, and some of the things that they had in common. We had people from the Arctic, we had people from the Marshall Islands, and the secretary, and it was fantastic. And you've got a great crowd about the size of this room to talk about these things and ask questions. So I was looking forward to going this year, because I certainly wasn't invited, of course, by the U.S. federal government to be on their delegation, but Sweden very kindly invited me to be part of theirs, because I had worked closely with them on these resilience documents in the past. So I went to speak at the Nordic Pavilion about Arctic resilience. Of course, my presence was not welcomed by the U.S. Embassy, but nonetheless, it was a great opportunity to see what was happening this year, and you can imagine that it was quite different. As you all know, Trump has announced that he intends to pull out of the Paris Agreement in 2020, when that's the earliest at which any country can pull out of it. So the U.S. presence was a little different this time. Instead of a pavilion and talks and presentations, there was a little office space with a closed door and a paper sign on it that said United States, and that was it. Right? The federal government wasn't going to engage. There were no high hopes around the COP for U.S. engagement or participation, no expectations. The pavilion, of course, was non-existent, and that's kind of where the hysterical sheep were holed up, right? I mean, the federal engagement from the U.S. was shameful, but counterintuitively and remarkably, the rest of America stepped up in a really surprising and wonderful way. They were led, this kind of a shadow delegation of non-federal folks, led by Mike Bloomberg and Jerry Brown, the governor of Washington, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, and Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, and many others. And they had a powerful message. And that message was, we're still in. So regardless of what you're hearing from the federal government, we're still in. And the reason that meant something, and I have to describe the Climate Action Center that they set up. I mentioned that the U.S. didn't have a pavilion this year, but they do. It's not the U.S. government, but there is a giant facility set up between the negotiating space and the pavilion space called the Climate Action Center. And that is what these folks, like Mike Bloomberg and others, have paid for. It's big and it's amazing, and the talks and convenings in there have been remarkable. And that's where they announced America's pledge. So that was this shadow delegation saying, hey, we've got 20 states, we've got 110 cities, we've got over 1,400 companies out there. We're all combining our efforts to hold ourselves to certain carbon dioxide limits, right? And combined, everyone that's part of America's pledge, you combine their GDPs together, they represent the largest nation on earth, or the third largest nation on earth behind the US and China. So this was a huge economy saying, hey, we're in. We know you've been hearing some bad stuff from the US. And it went over so well. I mean, the energy at this place was remarkable, and all these countries that were so prepared to just make fun of the US and be really upset that it wasn't going to, that this very pivotal piece of the puzzle wasn't going to be in place, suddenly reversed their opinions of the U.S. So for those of you that are embarrassed about what's happening with the Trump administration, I will say that the rest of America stepped up, and I still get goosebumps hearing about what's been going on. In fact, today, the heads of state showed up. Usually the last week, the heads of state show up. So Macron from France and Angela Merkel from Germany have been giving speeches, and they've been praising the U.S. And no one thought anybody would be praising the U.S. At this COP at all. Of course, they're not praising the federal government. They're praising this country. And so huge success, extremely well received. And the net effect, the Trump effect right now on what's going on there has been a net positive. And that's just stunning to me. Not only has Trump marginalized the federal government so much that it's created space for these more ambitious leaders to step in, but his rhetoric has turned up the volume on everyone's ambition at this thing, so the world is really responding in a positive way. So it's, for the first time, I came back from, I just got back, I'm still jet lagged, but I came back just thrilled with what we were doing on climate change. And the credit goes to these leaders who have stepped up. They didn't have to do it, both with investments and organizing skills. And so I think we can feel quite good about this. Now, let there be no mistake, the U.S. government still wanted to do an event. Some of you may have heard, it was an event celebrating coal and fossil fuels. It's interesting because the whole front of the room was packed. There were a lot of people there. But when they started presenting, they all started singing in protest. So when the security came and ushered out the protesters, there was no one left in the room. It was just the presenters. So, I mean, it was obviously this absurd thing. And Mike Bloomberg, I think, said it best. He said that promoting coal at a climate conference is like promoting tobacco at a cancer summit, right? Perfect. I mean, that's exactly right. And that's how it was taken. It didn't compromise the U.S. image there at all, just the federal government, just the Trump folks. And, that's an interesting analogy for another reason, right? Because the last time we saw science so compromised and so attacked was by those tobacco industry hacks who were trying to keep the cigarette and tobacco industry alive by lying about cancer, right? So it's not an inapt comparison. So progress is being made. We the people need to work really hard to limit the damage for a couple of years. But then we got to be ready to push aside the hysterical sheep, the vindictive seventh graders, right? We need to promote a grown-up agenda that leverages science and our collective national wisdom to build resilience and ensure that our kids and their kids have what we had, right? And I think what I learned in Bonn is that agenda is taking shape, and it's outside the federal government right now, but it's ready to be deployed. That North Star of science is still out there. We just need to look up and start walking. So thanks for coming tonight. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with these folks, my esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Kurt, why don't you start off? Because you too have had some experience in federal agencies and have had some sort of an insider's view of this. So.
Well, I was a political. As Joel described, there's a difference between politicals and career service. I will say leading the New England Regional Office of EPA was the opportunity of my lifetime, because I got to work with career talent like Joel. Very talented, very smart people who are deeply committed. Just to reflect on a couple of things that were said, the reason I guess I'm here, traveling from New England, was this story a couple of weeks ago about 3 scientists who work for the Atlantic Ecology Lab of EPA, which is down in Narragansett, Rhode Island. EPA has labs around the country. Some of them work for the Office of Research and Development, some of them work for regional offices. And these ORD labs are pure science, hardcore, trying to figure out, in that case, the Atlantic Ecology Lab, it's much about the marine environment. And so for years, there's been this thing called the Narragansett Bay Program, something I was involved in years ago as the executive director of Save the Bay, which is really looking at what's going on in a major coastal ecosystem like Narragansett Bay. And as my friend Sheldon Whitehouse likes to say, you can't argue with what's going on in the ocean. It's just incontrovertible. All you got to do is measure how the sea is rising or how the temperature is rising. So these scientists were basically just going to come report the facts of what's happened to the coastal marine environment. There's nothing political about that, but for some unknown reason, I agree with Joel, there's a certain amount of Keystone Cops going on here. At the very last minute, like the night before, they were told they could not talk about their research. And we were all, now that I'm at Brown and I was bringing students to the event, and we were all like, really? I mean, we get your issue and we understand the politics, but this is silly. And, but it caught a lot of attention. And that kind of speaks to some of what's going on, I think was really accurately described. The silliness inside of EPA on some of this is just jaw-dropping, jaw-dropping. Most of what EPA does is core public health protection, saving lives, reducing asthma, protecting beaches, things every American wants. There's no debate about that. So their issue with climate change has stretched into everything they do. Back to the point about industry capture, clearly there's an agenda there. The Clean Water Rule is a good example. I worked very hard on that. Very simple mission: define the boundaries of the Clean Water Act, or define the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, because Congress didn't do it. And the Supreme Court said, well, somebody's got to do it. And so finally EPA, and we kind of punted for a couple of years, I'm not sure why, finally stepped up and said we did it. I know why we finally did it, and you all know her probably. Gina McCarthy said in her classic kind of way, using language I shouldn't use here, we need to get going on this. And off we went. So that's kind of the perspective I've seen. One piece that's really important to understand about EPA is it's 10 regional offices. We're very decentralized as things stand for a regional office, for an organization like EPA. The genius behind the creation of EPA was this notion that environmental protection needs to be customized for place. So the way things work in New England are not the same way they might work in the southeastern part of the United States or in the western part of the United States. So each regional office has its own dynamicism around how it works. And it turns out to be quite resilient in the formal sense, because, and everyone will share this, my colleagues who were working in the southeastern part of the United States, where so-called red states, would always remind me that those members of Congress would call them as much as members of Congress would call me about brownfields grants, about things that needed to be done in every community in their region. So that resilience about EPA is one good point that I think you emphasized, was it's not like this is going to turn on a dime. This is a disruption to a system, and it's shuddering. It hasn't turned yet. And will it turn? I think what happens in fall of 2018 matters a lot. Obviously, what happens when the re-elect time comes around matters enormously. It'll shudder and it'll hold. I think it's like your colleagues are holding. They're just holding on. And in the regional office, less so. I mean, they feel much more apart from what's going on in DC. We always felt apart from what's going on in DC. You need to understand, because of all of you, the basic person who lives in New England shares these values. New England stands in a very different place in how these issues are being dealt with, from city councils all the way up to state legislatures and governors. So we always were like, well, we're moving ahead. To your point, we were working with partners and others who are outside the federal government all the time and trying to be a catalyst and actually trying to get on the train. That continues. I will say that does continue. I don't think you'll ever see Scott Pruitt come to New England. Just wouldn't be a good visit. And that's just the way it is. Now, again, it can hold for only so long in terms of the basic things the agency does. Issues of budget cuts, retirement, forced retirements, these big strategies are underway. Of course, they don't know how to do it very well. We did some ourselves because we had to, because of the Republican Congress was cutting budgets. But they're not terribly competent, and they haven't hired people. So we'll just hope the system holds until change does come.
Okay, well, Andrew, you've been, in a sense, outside the government, but in close alliance with scientists all your life, so can you give us a perspective?
Actually, I was inside the government. I'm also a senior executive service member. I was 10 years at NOAA and as well as in university. And I certainly admire what Joel has done and what he's saying in many respects. One of them is that I think it's helping people get a better sense of actually what happens inside government agencies. I was a career civil servant in NOAA. I was a regional administrator for fisheries here in New England and then in Washington, and then moved back into academia and now at Union of Concerned Scientists. And my experience in previous administrations was that new political people always come in and they always have a particular viewpoint. In the first Bush administration and the Clinton administration, a little bit with the second Bush administration in my experience. But the first thing they do is try to understand what their agency is supposed to do and talk to the professionals, people like Joel, and when I was in that position, people like me. You prepare to brief them and you try to give them a sense of the capability of the agencies and the things that you're working on, as well as the mission. Well, my sense in this administration is there was no interest in that. And what I'm hearing across many, many agencies is that the political people coming in have no interest in talking to the professionals. They have no interest in that knowledge. They're coming in with a very specific agenda. That's okay. You would expect an agenda, but not an agenda that is in complete opposition to the mission of the agency. And the people that are being appointed, I wrote a little while ago, is classified into 3 bins. There are some people who are fundamentally conflicted. They, have a financial conflict of interest with the job that they're about to do. They were just working as a lobbyist for a major chemical company, and now they're hired to write chemical rules. There are people who are fundamentally opposed to the mission of the agency they are now leading, which is sort of the example that Joel gave, but also is true for some of the people who have been in EPA, some of those who are now being considered for appointments in NOAA, in Department of Energy. The guy who's running the Renewable Energy Office spent most of his career lobbying against renewable energy. He's just fundamentally opposed to the mission of the job that he's assigned to do. And then there are people who are just fundamentally unqualified. So there's the conflicted, the opposed, and the unqualified, which is a great grouping, and I only went through about a dozen nominees, but it was pretty easy to put those into those bins. You know, the former White House science advisor was John Holdren, who many here might know, a very highly respected physicist, former president of AAAS, now back at Harvard, head of the Woods Hole Research Center. The current person who, there is no White House science advisor, the person who is occupying the position and doing that job has a degree in Hellenic Studies from Princeton, and then worked as an investment banker, and then worked for Peter Thiel as a chief of staff, and he's the chief technology officer for the United States right now. That's fundamentally unqualified to do the job of being a science advisor. One thing I might disagree with a little bit is that there is a lot of incompetence going around, but this is not an unthought of strategy. A lot of the attacks that we're seeing on science have a very long history, have been pushed by groups like Heritage and Heritage Action, sometimes AEI, sometimes other industry groups, American Chemistry Council, American Petroleum Institute. They have been pushing these ideas of regulatory rollbacks, opening public lands, downsizing the federal government so that the permitting operations, the analysis operations are all very much smaller. We can, industry should provide the science, not the agency. That is a concerted strategy, and in some ways they are executing it very well, even though to us it's ham-fisted. And they don't seem to think that most of the rules and laws apply to them, and so there will be pushback and they will lose some of this. But I'm worried if we think that they're bumbling, because they're not. The attacks are really very powerful, and it takes a long time to fight them off, even if you fight them in the courts, which is something Union of Concerned Scientists works with other groups on. Another thing about that is that in previous administrations, including the Bush administration, and really all administrations, there were at times things that were fundamentally opposed to science, dismissal of scientific information, trying to silence scientists or block them from saying certain terms, and that was true, when I was in NOAA, and has been in every other administration. Very much more in the Bush administration, and now on steroids in the Trump administration. The big difference is that even in the Bush administration, when we, concerned citizens, civil society organizations, whistleblowers, called them out, there would be some shame. You could name and shame people publicly, there would be congressional oversight, there would be some pushback. The current administration is completely shameless. They don't care. Couldn't care less about the publicity that Joel has brought around his position. They will only be rolled back if congressional oversight restarts. And that's a very hard thing to do. There has never been a time that I'm aware of where Congress didn't take its constitutional responsibility for oversight of agencies, regardless of which party was in power in Congress or in party in the White House. And you guys probably are very familiar with being called up to the Hill and being yelled at quite extensively, as I was, by members of both parties if they didn't like what you were doing. That's really not happening. So right now they have a completely free hand. They don't care about the exposure in the press or to the public until the public makes its voice heard. So the only accountability will come from public protest. And then the final thing I will say is I am very worried about all of the federal agencies. And the thing I most worry about is, yes, there are many retirements and losing incredible talent, people who are dedicated, brilliant at what they do, and have worked for many, many years at issues like climate change, chemical safety, environmental justice, and so on. But there also is really no hiring of young, bright professionals into the federal government, or very little. We basically have told, if you like the best and the brightest in the country, don't go work for government, there's nothing for you there. And I think that has the potential to do a generation's worth of damage to our democracy, because you want people coming out with science degrees, public policy degrees, and all kinds of professional qualifications to say I could use my skills in government. I could, see my work in the Department of Interior or in the EPA or wherever it might be, not turn away and say, government is hopeless, there's no way I can do what I want to do there. And so that really worries me at the other end, in addition to people like Joel leaving, which is a real loss to the public and in the public interest. The fact that students here are much less likely to consider going into public service. I'll stop there.
Very good. Wow, this is very sobering. Reminds me, in fact, of the anxiety of Helen Caldicott about nuclear engineers and in a sense, the denigration of the whole field of nuclear engineering. Her appeals for years and years have been, listen, go into that field. Don't avoid it, because we need people to cope with nuclear waste for generations to come. So this question of, should we expect more resignations? Is it good that there are more resignations? All of that is really quite problematic, because in a sense there's got to be someone there to know what's going on, to document what's happening, and even to perhaps protect the data itself. I don't know if either of you from EPA or from the Interior have any experience with not so much the attack on existing data. We've heard about pulling the plug on various websites or things like this, but the acquisition of data. I mean, both of you have been working in agencies that have substantial mandates to find out information. The scientific core of the research of the USGS that you mentioned, for example, or within EPA. Has just the defunding meant that won't happen from now on in, or are there alternate ways to get it funded in the private sector?
I think it's important to understand the environmental protection system, as we know it, is a very decentralized system with states and EPA. Okay. So a lot of the data collection actually occurs by states. Just say the Clean Air Program, probably the most important data we collect is what's coming off our national air monitoring system and compliance with the national quality standards, right? So a lot of that is embedded in states, which is a good thing. Somebody was really smart. Again, I want to speak to the people who thought about this environmental protection system in terms of EPA and the need to distribute that authority. And then states went ahead and took on their own authority. So hopefully, if the federal role in this, and I agree the federal role is being diminished, states will continue to collect and hold and act on. I think that's what you saw in Bonn to some degree. I think states, a lot of states have picked up the mantle, and even red states. One of the interesting things I did during my time as regional administrator was participate in something called Enterprise for the Environment, a collaborative effort with the National Council of States, Environment Council of States, called ECOS. And we held these meetings and we talked about our system and how it needed to be changed. And one of the conversations was about data. And the other thing that's going on that's really interesting is the fact that data isn't the purview of just big science, big universities and big government anymore. That with technology and innovation, we have air monitors that are relatively inexpensive that actually are pretty good, that talent from almost any class in any of these classrooms in this great place can use. And we actually had a meeting at Tufts about that when I was regional administrator. This is something I was very fascinated with, is the idea of citizen science, right, and the rising citizen science movement, which then forces someone to be confronted with this, right? So science is changing, or data is changing. Big data is overtaking the world of environment. It cannot be stopped. It's fundamentally powerful and democratic in that way. So it's just chaotic. I mean, one would hope.
But isn't that
one would
problem?
hope that what the federal government can do is bring some rational systems thinking to the movement that's going on. Guys like what Andrew did when he was in his job and what you did in your job. When you guys, the SES has a role in just sort of continually working through this over careers that extend My deputy was in the job for 42 years. That's important. And so that's what's being lost. But I'm not worried about a lot of data being collected. Let's put it that way. And I'm pretty encouraged that states are going to fill that void. Most states will, even Texas. Texas is kind of an interesting case. I met with,
Interesting,
you know,
lots of ways,
the head
yeah.
of the Texas their environmental agency, actually was from Massachusetts. And some elected members in Texas, people don't know this, the Texas governor has almost no power, so they spout off. And they would shoot their mouth off all the time. And he would come over to us and say, look, we value the relationship. We value the consistency of what we're doing. And so even there, notwithstanding the woman who was just nominated for the,
Yeah.
that's unbelievable.
Catherine Harnett White.
Yeah, you know, there's a pride and professionalism that extends across these agencies.
Sure, but
That's
let's
the
take
one hope.
two examples, one in your department, as it were, and one in the EPA. The toxic released inventory,
Yes.
for example, was very important for anybody dealing in environmental justice. As Andrew knows, I mean, anybody who's trying to make the case is looking for data from the toxic release inventory. If that flow of data stops, there's a big problem in trying to
There
make
is.
citizen case.
But citizens can act on that, I think. I think that's still, I'm right. If they don't report, there's plenty of work. U.S. Union Concerned Scientists and others are watching that data system very, very carefully. Whether they, and to be honest with you, another point, most companies are not interested in this thing that's going on. They're in it for the long term. So if they stop reporting and get exposed, eventually they know DOJ might catch up to them. You know, it's not like these things go away and every DOJ attorney will go away. So that I'm not so worried about. I'm more worried about the look at new problems.
Okay.
Like climate problems.
To address your Interior Department, stream gauges are extremely important nationwide. For one thing, they give you the sense of where the rain is falling and where it's not and how it's flowing. That is information that has been marshaled by and made public through the USGS. If that isn't forthcoming, or if it goes state by state, since rivers flow across different states, it's very much more atomized and decentralized and unintelligible, basically. And so there's an interest in trying to keep sort of the national focus on this kind of thing. Now, in the past, the USGS within the Department of Interior has been highly respected by petroleum geologists because they realize that's where the real science is going on. But if this intrusion now of the capture of departments by industries is proceeding apace, is that kind of information going to be snuffed out?
I think I was going to use that example and the satellites example, Landsat and others. You know, there are some big science data collection efforts that require federal funding. There's a lot of infrastructure and expense, and those are the ones that I most worry about, and that they're the least inoculated by having partnerships with states and other entities. And so the stream gauges have always been on the ropes a little bit. You know, every budget, it's just tough for some reason getting them all funded. And a few get wiped out. I think we're needing to replace a number of them, obviously, in Texas now. But so, yeah, I worry about that. I worry about, right now, the Arctic observing satellites. We're down to one, I think, and if anything happens to that satellite, we're no longer able to track trends in the part of the planet that's warming twice as fast as everywhere else on Earth. So, you know, these observing, this observing infrastructure of ours is always a tough sell on the Hill. But of course, now you have this upside down dynamic where normally the president's budget goes to the Hill, says, here's what we want to fund in our agency. We want to take care of this at DOI or EPA now, and then Congress dials it back in some way, or they inflate certain programs and deflate others in terms of budgets. Congress that determines how much each agency gets. Now we have a president's budget that is just bottoming out almost everything, and they're actually threatening to, because Congress is going to say, well, no, we're going to fund that because this is important to implementing the laws that we have passed in Congress. You have members of this administration saying, well, then we might just not spend that money. which is unprecedented.
That's a crisis.
It's also illegal.
Exactly.
Crisis.
So I think what we're seeing, and this is one of those ham-fisted, this is the rhetoric that they use, right? And that's unprecedented, and that's bizarre, and that's what I mean by sort of immature approaches to governance. So yeah, I worry a lot about some of these big federal research programs.
That's a big EPA problem, because there's the core programs, but then there's these other programs that tend to work in collaborative structures, like the Narragansett Bay program or these other programs, which allow agencies to actually collaborate across federal silos and the like. And they've said they're just cutting all of that. And I wonder, if Congress restores that, will they fund it? I don't know.
Well, Andrew,
Well, I
you
mean,
may
there-
have seen this from NOAA too. Obviously,
Yeah.
they have to work across states, and they would have done a lot in the Arctic, for example, with, in fact, there was,
Well, I mean, all of these problems are common across agencies, and the Arctic is a little bit different, I think, in some ways in funding, because the constituency is different. But, try to close a weather station in someone's district, and you will hear lots and lots of screaming, even if they think the entire weather service should be shut down. They don't want the weather station in their district closed. And so it is very difficult to dial back some of those programs, but as Joel says, this administration has said some things that we've never heard before. Well, even if Congress tells us to spend the money, because that's how the Constitution works, we might not. And also, this goes back to the idea of downsizing agencies. Congress doesn't set the number of people in the agencies. So if you reduce Interior Department staff by thousands, the State Department staff by thousands, as some of you might have read, or EPA's staff or NOAA's staff, you can simply say, well, yeah, but we don't have the people to do that work. Sometimes they'll contract it out, which is what previous administrations have done. Sometimes it will just go undone. And I don't know if that's going to extend to data collection systems, but it's more likely that the work just won't get done because you don't have the people to do it. The federal government isn't huge because, it has this bloated payroll, the usual rhetoric. It's huge because it does a huge number of things. Yeah. And, like any big company, sure, there are people who don't do very much, or, projects that don't go very well, but mostly, people work incredibly hard, and you're doing a huge number of things. Beyond, anything that most people sort of imagine if they're not working in a federal agency. Or to quote our president, whoever knew that government was so complicated. So I think there will be some data systems that are lost because of satellite loss or because of just not replacing infrastructure, and that does long-term damage. I think the bigger problem is the skill loss. The infrastructure loss, okay, you can recover from that. There's a hole in the data set, but the skill loss takes longer to rebuild.
I wanted to add to that, because this is the startling statistic of the day, that we have 70,000 employees at Interior. From what I understand, 50 or 60% of them will be retirement eligible in the next 5 or 6 years. So that means tens of thousands of vacancies, and I'm always encouraging college students to think about this, and I say don't think about it now because it doesn't look good. This is a tough time to consider a federal job. But in a couple of years when things swing back, and of course a lot of those people are choosing now to retire or leave, but we have an opportunity to completely reboot civil service, I think, and to bring in a lot of those bright young folks that take for granted that, of course, diversity in the workplace is what you want. And of course, climate change has an impact on the American economy. They take that stuff for granted, they know it, and have them in there rebuilding these jobs. And the difficult thing, as Andrew and others have said, is that you lose a lot of institutional knowledge, and that's a hit. But the opportunity, of course, the glass half full part, is that you can really reboot the civil service workforce.
But we have to send that signal that working in public service is a really good way to spend your career, or part of your career. In my case, part of my career. Yeah. And it's really important to counter that rhetoric of, government is bad, government is just a waste of time. Don't go there, because we want those people.
So we went through this cycle, and indeed at EPA, the retirement numbers are what they are, and every office, as you can imagine, the senior executive and the political executive are thinking about this. We did go recruit a bunch of young people, and surprisingly, we got a pretty good reaction. Our strategy was to try to reduce the cost of our workforce, so we kind of pushed past a certain number, did some early retirements, exactly so we could hire. And we did, and we recruited hard, and people came in. I'm very interested to know how many are staying through this crisis. But we also, and I'd love your perspective, our SCS team and branch chief teams and teams below that, we're very clear with the young people that this is part of the deal. Not this bad,
Right.
but there's always political change. And you guys both speak to it very well. In your remarks, you spoke to it just a little bit. There's normal agenda-setting differences. But EPA went through the situation with Reagan back in a long time ago. And it lasted about 2 years. People forget that the Gorsuch, Vito Lavelle crisis didn't just happen in a week. It seems like it was a very short period, but really it was a 2-year period. And we're only a year in, not even, right? And it's so tumultuous. There's a lot of people who are saying, well, how can this really last? So hopefully things will settle out. What's amazing, I love your perspective, is they don't seem to care about sustaining what they're doing. In the end of the day, Ronald Reagan wanted to get reelected, and that's why everything changed. Everybody stood up and said, we don't want EPA decimated. And wise people told him, oh, governor or president, if you want to get reelected, you got to shift back here. They don't seem to care about that either. And I don't understand that politics. The normal stuff that's supposed to happen, the blowback is happening.
Right.
No president at this time has been at, what, 35%? And
But it is politics of destruction.
yeah, and I guess they're going to do as much
the
as they
agency.
can for as short as amount of, and I don't know if they've decided that they're going to be a short-term wrecking ball.
Well, I think-
Ironically, I don't think that works. I frankly don't.
Well, I think a lot of these issues, the Interior Department issues, endangered species issues, which Joel didn't mention, but are also under attack, the EPA, the chemical safety issues, air quality, water quality issues, they're speaking to actually a pretty narrow constituency. It's not all industry. It's the American Chemistry Council or the National Manufacturers Association or American Petroleum Institute or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who are pushing for the most extreme view of their members and are not really pulled back to the middle by the bulk of the industry views. And they only care what, Pruitt only cares what Heritage says and what American Chemistry Council says. And so those are the only people that he will talk to. And that is a very short-term strategy because you just can't govern that way when you're talking to such a narrow constituency unless you fundamentally undermine democracy. So the set of attacks, and there's reports in the back of the room from Union of Concerned Scientists on what we call sidelining science from day one, the first 6 months report for Trump administration, is very broad across the agencies, but they are short-term attacks. And I think they must, they're not completely stupid. They must know they're going to lose a lot of this stuff in court. But it doesn't matter because you've established, you've broken the system enough so that, you've satisfied that narrow constituency of donors, whether it be the Mercers or somebody, or the Cooks or whoever it is.
Can I ask Joel a question?
Sure.
The corporate world is not aligned. Where some of the tech companies and some of the larger, more most people think futurist, more powerful companies in Bonn as part of the American response.
Yeah, I think there were 1,400 companies that had signed on to America's pledge, and they were across sectors. It's anything from renewable energy, of course, to tech. It was a pretty broad spectrum, and it's impressive. And to your point and to Andrew's point, none of these industries are monolithic, and that's something we found out. The methane rule, for example, is a pretty good example of this, right? I mean, this administration has been trying to reverse this Obama-era rule on venting and flaring of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, more powerful than CO2, but it's more short-lived. And this rule was put in place by the prior administration. And this administration has been trying and getting setbacks from the courts, but trying to get rid of that rule. And it's throwing the industry into a little bit of turmoil because the big players, the big companies, they want certainty. They want to know what's going to happen. They don't like the seesawing of policy. It's those smaller companies that are owned by some of the donors that need a way into the sector and don't have the big money. They're not worried about certainty. They're looking for a play here and there to make some money. So it is not a monolithic thing in any of these sectors, and it was great to see some of these companies aligned in Bonn. And there are others, of course, that we're not going to see go anywhere near that kind of thing because they're not looking to do the right thing. They're looking to make a buck. Yeah.
Have any of you experienced the kind of international dimension of this? Right after the Paris Accord, there was a big statement by the French president saying, climate scientists, if you're not welcome, after America, if you're not welcome in the United States, come work here to France.
Yeah, there are some people who have responded to that call, but they're mostly at different career stages. I mean, if you're a postdoc, that's pretty appealing. If you have an established lab, it's much harder to do. I think the international dimension is that we become an unreliable partner. You know, it's not that there isn't great work going on or there isn't a lot of energy, but if a change of election can totally change the way that we view our science, do our science, and so on, that means you're sort of an unreliable partner, and scientists pay attention to that as much as the policy people do. And that's some of the damage of not engaging fully in a lot of the international relations part of this. I mean, following out the State Department actually affects science. It affects certainly the climate work, but also the work that I've done on oceans and other issues. Because you're no longer, or biodiversity conservation, because you don't have professionals there who've been tracking these things and will carry it from one administration to the next. And all of a sudden you have an administration coming in saying, no, we don't feel any obligation to honor previous commitments. Yeah. And that's devastating if you're trying to build long-term relations, I think. But it doesn't mean people will dismiss us, but we have become an unreliable partner.
That may be as much of impact, long-term impact, as anything that's gone on here. You know, the conversations about the Chinese filling the void and their ambitions, and Europe realizing, no, we're not going to look to the U.S. to be a leader on not just climate, but other matters. And the American electorate is unstable, and the Constitution is, you know, all these issues.
That's why the signal that you were saying of states and others filling in in Bonn is so incredibly important.
What federalism is.
Okay. Well, at this point, we should probably move to public questions. Anyone who would like to address a question to the members of the panel and to Joel himself, please come to the central mic and state your name and what your question is.
My name is Robert Chu, Cambridge resident. I thank you all for your wonderful service and for a very important service and for being here tonight. And I have a question about this latest climate science report. How did it get published relatively unscathed, and what's the significance of that?
I'm glad you asked that. I'd forgotten to mention it in my talk, because as the climate change guy at DOI, I was the principal to the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is the organization that was created by Congress, by law, to continue this research, this world-class research on what's happening with climate science, what's happening with global change. I was responsible for reviewing, to conduct the review at Interior of documents like that one. And that had been in process for a couple of years. And I was very skeptical that that was going to come out. In fact, I was thrilled. A lot of authors were not. But when it was leaked in August and the New York Times wrote about it, regardless of process, it was a great exposure of what this document said, because this is some real world-class science. And I would say right now, all the folks in Bonn would agree that that's the state of climate science right now. They reviewed over 1,500 papers. They had authors, not just federal agency authors, they had private sector and academic authors. This was the most transparent, almost frustratingly transparent and rigorous process out there. So it would have been really tough to hold it back. But ultimately and cynically, I think, I worry that the reason they let it out, of course they realized the less they said about it, the less publicity they would get. But I think they don't care about science. It doesn't mean anything to them or their base or their donors. And I think this was just yet another scientific report. Now, it was incredibly good, and I think the rest of the world gets that. But the fact that it contradicted everything they're saying in the administration, everything, didn't matter to them because it's science, and they have created this sort of anti-intellectualist cabal that says, well, that's science. You know, it used to be, that's science, you know. Now it's, oh, that's just science, right? And so they've established science as this fringe thing for them, for their supporters and for their donors. And I don't know how you guys feel. I'd like to hear what you think about that, because to me,
I agree fully. I mean, I was involved in the previous National Climate Assessment, and it was rolled out, and, you know, White House announcement and so on. This one, they just pretty much ignored. I think they didn't have too much choice because there were so many copies of it circulating anyway. It's not like they could have really suppressed it and everyone could have compared the copies. And it would have drawn more attention to it if they tried to do something than by just ignoring it. But I also think that as long as you continue that strategy of saying, oh, science is just another political opinion, just like everything is fake news, but I mean, that is the line, that basically science is a political view. There's no evidence, there's no process, it's just they're putting out a political document and we don't care. And so a strategy of ignoring it for, again, that very narrow constituency that they're interested in. I mean, they don't really care about speaking to you or to broader government. That's why this issue of accountability is so difficult. They don't have any real shame about the fact that they're dismissing a world-class report that should be informing public policy. Because to that, they would just dismiss it to their supporters as that's just another political document, we don't care. Unfortunately, that's difficult, but we need more and more people to care so they can't get away with that.
Well, one of the problems with that is that the public generally responds to what's called the range of thinkable thought. And if they don't know it's thinkable to think about the information they're not getting, then they can't themselves pose embarrassing or provocative or intriguing questions.
Well, I mean, but the Achilles heel for all of this and for the president himself is that his credibility is so low on any issue that people do pay attention and want to make up their own minds as opposed to accepting the received wisdom. I mean, his credibility is really low. Whatever the Post said the other day, you know, in 200 and something days, 1,628, you know, demonstrable falsehoods from the president himself. I mean, so that hopefully you get there from there.
Can I ask a question on that? Two things. One is, where is the science going to come from if it's not being funded? So, Joel, your job's gone. No one's doing it, right? So no one's looking at that particular part of the populations in the Arctic. Secondly, where do we go to get, do we have to rely on leaked information now to get scientific facts? I mean, it's a dilemma for the public.
So I can start, or Joel, do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
So I think, I mean, first of all, a lot of the science is still going on. It's not like the funding has gone away. First of all, the president's put out a budget which isn't in effect. There's lots of bad things happening, but many of the functions are still moving forward at a clumsy and halting pace. There's still an awful lot of university work, research institute work, international work that is continuing to push forward. All of those authors of the National Climate Assessment Special Science Report are still doing their work one place or another. I think that there is a continual barrage of Freedom of Information Act requests going at this government, much more than ever before, to say, no, you can't keep the information secret. And I mean, the science report was not leaked. It was public. It was circulated. it just wasn't in a lot of people's view screen, but it was public.
That's
And
why I use the air quotes.
yeah, I mean, that's, so I think in some sense, the people who are leading the administration are victims of their own rhetoric of thinking that all this stuff is being done secretly and the government does it secretly. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I worked for government, I couldn't go to lunch without publishing a public notice. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we had so many FOIAs, Freedom of Information Act requests, from all sides on everything. During the Obama administration, it just got to be a huge management problem for us. I mean, whether it was a Superfund site in Maine or just any piece of information, and it's kind of got its own machine aside. We were buying software to help us figure out how to deal with all these data requests that were coming all the time. And I don't think they can just wave a hand and say, we're not going to honor that law. So the information will get out. It's hard to do. You need to be an informed group. You need to have capability to do that. And honestly, there needs to be some general sense that Trump didn't come out of the blue. I mean, there's been a deterioration of the situation over, I mean, your tenure is long enough to probably speak to it, but the people who've been working in federal service for a long time have lamented just how challenging it's gotten in terms of the way people have been treating the federal government overall. And sometimes that came from the other side too. I mean, there's wings on each side, and we need to remember that. So,
But in specific reference to the climate, the rhythm of the IPCC reports was actually pretty important, because maybe they weren't on time, maybe they were a year late, but there were periodic, every 5 years or so, a set of reports that came out, at least gave journalists enough to go through and say, listen, I think this is what they said last time, this is what they're saying this time, there's a difference, and there's a movement. Now, the IPCC has basically disappeared or dissolved in its periodic reporting function. The public doesn't get that sense of a 5-year report anymore. We don't know which agency to turn to now for authoritative government material. On the reception end, as the questioner just put it, where do we turn to? Where's the agglomerator of news, information, authoritative data?
Yeah, well, first of all, the IPCC is still at work. There are some reports coming soon. So that drumbeat will continue, and they still are. It's a very rigorous and transparent process. So we'll see a couple more. Actually, I think in the next year or so. One, I think, on adaptation and resilience. I'm not sure. So those are still coming, and of course the National Climate Assessment is still required every 4 years. Now it doesn't happen every 4 years. We've just seen the science report, which is generally the first chapter of this thing, come out, but there'll be more. So the National Climate Assessment, unless they find a way to stifle that will still come out. And what that does is take the climate science piece and marry it with the regions of the U.S. and what are the impacts likely to be. So it is very closely connected to people and industry and their needs. So I think we'll still see those documents coming out. And I do, as Andrew said, I do think a lot of the science is still going on. There's a lot of rhetoric right now about shutting things down, but the budgets haven't come into play yet. And FOIA is an interesting tool. I'm enjoying the other side now.
yes, you get to do so.
Yeah, it's
I've
much
been doing
nicer
quite a
when you
few. In fact, I sued the Department of the Interior yesterday for not responding to my FOIA requests over the last few months.
But that felt good.
It felt, now there's a Clement v. Zinke lawsuit out there. I feel pretty satisfied, but that is a really, really important tool that we can't forget. It's meant to be to increase transparency. It's the law, and what we're finding is they are not responding to these FOIA requests, even though it's a huge drag to do. We all had to do it when we were in the agencies, but we did it, and we generated those products, and now they're not doing it at all. And just in connection to my case and the mass reassignment of as many as 50 senior executives, they haven't released a single document, and there have been dozens of FOIA requests about that incident alone. And that's why I'm suing, and that's why I sued yesterday.
That brings up an interesting issue. In time, their strategy gets tied into sort of a mess of legal things that are just going to make it hard. I mean, we all dealt with that, and
Well, it is hard if citizens have to sue their own government to get access to data that they've already paid for as taxpayers.
right.
But that's the world we live in.
That's the word we live in.
It's
But
a very
the point
upside
is, when
down.
they don't respond, it's going to create a paralysis, I think, in time. Their lawyers are just going to, as we all know, working in federal agencies, the chief counsel, a very powerful and important role to help everyone stay on track and stay inside the boundaries of the law. And the more they go outside that, the more the courts will have their opportunity to weigh in. And I think we've seen the federal courts are not being hesitant today. And so
Well,
hopefully
the
the courts will continue to be active.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing so many sort of bizarre interactions like this. It's a little bit, I think even the courts are a little bit stunned
They're
by what
freaks.
they're up against. And, you know, we've got an EPA administrator now that's saying, if you've received grants from the EPA, if you're such a good scientist, you've gotten government grants to do your work, you're no longer qualified to sit on advisory boards
Yeah.
for the EPA. It just makes no sense at all. And
But if you are paid by industry, then you are
certainly can.
entirely
then
independent.
yes,
and
then you have
objective.
no conflict of interest if you're an industry scientist. So it really is stunning the lengths to which they will go to just create chaos and avoid science and prevent good science from leading their policy decisions. It's stunning.
And they'll be in court on that one, too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a lot, almost all this is illegal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think the system is stuck.
Yeah.
Which is bad.
My name is Patrick Sullivan. I'm a Cambridge resident, and I really appreciate what you're doing, and you've terrified me enough to think about my 4-year-old grandson and be worried about whether he's going to have a planet to live on. So my concern as a citizen is, what the hell do we do? How do we take what you know and tie it to the average citizen to energize some kind of blowback and some kind of energy in a consistent way that makes a difference? Because, I mean, I really admire the work you do, all the reports you develop, all the science that you know, but if that doesn't get translated into my grandchild might not have a planet to live on, if it doesn't get that basic, people aren't going to get it. They just aren't going to get it because they don't understand what you understand.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the reasons, thank you for the question, because that's one of the reasons why I came away from Bonn feeling a little more optimistic, because that America's Pledge announcement was about cities and states and companies, and all of us are part of one of those things, if not more. And you know, I think there are a lot of opportunities to register our concerns through those channels. We don't have to just look to the federal government, which is right now a dysfunctional mess. We can look to the place we work. We can talk, of course, to our state legislators and congressional representation and reach out and say, hey, this is what we value. I feel like, you know, obviously elections matter and your vote matters, and that's something to really think about for anyone that has not been voting. Of course, we need to do that. But you vote these people in, or someone does, you have access to them. Those are your representatives, and it's, you can call them anytime. You can call them every day. You can call them every hour. People have been doing that. And, but they're also your company, you know, the companies you work for or that are in your community and your communities themselves. There are opportunities to register your concerns up through these channels, and I think we just all need to be doing that a lot more. And I never thought about that before, right? And I think that's something we all need to really step up and do.
Let me add one thing
wanna
to
add
that,
one
which is, you know, people do underestimate the power of constituency, but then here, Cambridge or Massachusetts, people say, well, but my elected officials, they already know this stuff, they agree. But remember that it still matters. They need to be able to go to their colleagues and say, this is a do or die issue for my constituents. Constituency is currency on Capitol Hill, in the State House, wherever it is. And so it still matters that people are speaking out to your elected representatives on both sides of the aisle to tell them that things matter to you, not just in general, I care about climate change, but the specifics. No, we need to keep funding, the data, or we need to have a national climate assessment and so on. And you can become, you don't have to be expert, but you do have to be, exercise that constituency. And I think it does matter more than people realize.
I want to jump off of Joel's theme.
Well,
I just need to add this one point.
Okay.
If you step back and said, wow, we need to make this enormous change, transform our economy to the way we need to do. And if you said, well, what would that look like, if you asked that question 10 years ago, what do you think would happen politically? I think you reasonably might think that you get some very difficult political times ahead, very rough water, to go through that change. And I sort of step back and go at times saying, well, really, this is a sign that we're going through this very hard thing to do, which is turn away from a source of energy that is funded and done amazing things in the world. Poverty rates are lower than they've ever been. But it's not sustainable. And so you could look at Donald Trump and all that goes with it. It was an anomalous event, but the themes are there. This was not going to be an easy road. It really wasn't. And the fact that we're going through this hard time, to me, I always take as, well, something big is happening. And we should take solace in that and realize renewable energy, I forgot the numbers, renewable energy is going to be cheaper than gas in like 5 years. The numbers look very positive about how we could get there. And we just have to think about that.
Okay,
and make it happen.
Hi, my name is Diogo Teixeira. I'm a resident of Wellesley and a bit of a layman in this area. I would like to say that the previous speaker's statement that your grandson will not have a planet to live on is a bit hysterical. And I'd say that's part of the problem that we have with the environmental climate change business is comments like that, thinking like that, because it is clearly not right, and it's just, so let me go on. I read a book a couple years ago by I think a Danish scientist who, very legitimate, and you might know him, he questioned a lot of this stuff.
Bjorn Lorborg.
He's not
legitimate.
He's not a scientist.
Not very credible.
Okay, but you know who I'm talking about, right?
We do, yes.
I read the book, and he had a lot of examples in there, one of which I remember was, Miami Beach is going to be swamped. Well, the solution is just, look, here's what Miami Beach looked like in 1917. You just didn't build right on the ocean, and that would solve a lot of the problems. So what I'd like to know, my question is, why is it that the scientists can't show us in realistic terms 50 years from now what it's going to look like, assuming we don't make all these wonderful changes the liberals would like? I'd like to know what that would look like. I don't think it looks like no planet. I don't think it looks like no people. What would it look like? Thank you.
So those projections have been made. There's lots of maps of those, of Boston, of lots of other places. Different people present or perceive risks in very different ways, and some people mean this is view a risk as a third or half of Boston being underwater, as which is what the projections would show in 50 years, as being, well, no big deal, we'll just move, and other people view that as a tremendous risk. But those projections have been around for a long time. They get better and better as people redo the science many different ways, but it's quite true that the changes are extremely dramatic, and whether you choose to call that hysterical because somebody says, no, these are very big changes, that's your choice, but the projections are available.
Live on, and a third of Boston.
Well, yeah, there is, but if somebody's talking about their grandson, as the gentleman did, and thinking about that lifespan till the end of the century, I think there are real concern. There are risks that are, in many areas, catastrophic. And so I don't object to the fact that somebody would worry about those kinds of changes. There's lots of possibilities in between. You might believe the policy position is we should all boil. I mean, okay, that there's all kinds of policy choices, but the science is there. So to say the scientists have not shown us these projections is just because you haven't looked at them.
Hi, my name is Werner Grundl. My name is Werner Grundl. I'm a resident of Cambridge, and I'm a videographer. You might remember me, Tim Weiskeli. And so I've been looking at the whole environmental situation for a long time, and because of that, I have grown in me certain feelings about what is really going on. And the gentleman that referred to his grandson reminded me of this. A lot of the information that we're getting in regards to climate change or any kind of change we're going through comes to us as information, and at the end is fear attached to it. So what causes him to express this particular fear for his grandson's future comes from the way how a lot of information comes to us and how we interpret the information. One thing I've been missing tonight is, for example, some positive information outside of your experience in Bonn, which I wish I could have been there, but I'm from Germany. I've been following some people in Cambridge for a while that deal with the fact about if the climate change has to do with the fact that we have too much carbon in the air. There are other things. We have to somehow think about the fact, how do we reverse that process? So in other words, people should slowly be introduced to solutions to what we got ourselves into, so that people can get over the fact of being too afraid about there's nothing we can do. For the last 30 years, I've heard from my friends and colleagues in this freestyle communication business that everything is lost. There's nothing we can do, and I stamped against that consistently. So what I've learned in the last few years is people want to remind us that we're coming out of an agricultural industry, kind of, right? In other words, we've disturbed the planet through our industrialized agriculture that totally disturbed the way nature would normally take care of itself and balance out. And somehow we have to teach people how to green the planet again, how to grow food in a different way, how to reforest. I think, in other words, getting the carbon out of the air is the important thing.
Right.
And I don't hear enough in that regards.
And that was one of the things that was so fantastic about Bonn, is you're wandering from pavilion to pavilion, and you're hearing presentations about solutions and what we need to do. Of course, we need to pivot away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and there are a lot of great numbers out there, a lot of positive opportunities out there, both in terms of adaptation and resilience and changing our energy regimes out there. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Good evening. I'm enjoying this very, very much. It's very educational. I have two rather naive questions, I think. My name is Jane Sturdivant. The first question was, I wanted to ask, I had heard a little bit before you spoke when you said you had the seminar and two of the gentlemen that were scientists were going to speak, were immediately called from DC and told they couldn't speak?
Right.
That's scary to me. That's very Hitlerish sounding to me.
Yeah, and for the
now,
record,
what would have happened had those gentlemen ignored that and spoke anyway? Would they have lost their jobs?
just to be fair, to respect my wife, who's a scientist, it was three women scientists, actually. Well, they did what good civil servants do. You know, they respected what they were told. You know, there's you guys can speak to it, but there's an ethic in civil service. You don't just stand up and blow off something that comes from your administrator's office. It's something you do, and then you work on the issue going forward. So they just stood down. They were allowed to come to the meeting. I don't think they did come to the meeting. Others at the meeting spoke very emotionally in support of them and what this chilling or this censoring meant. To your point, I wouldn't use the word, it's a dangerous word to use, but it smacks of some very troubling ways of thinking at the highest levels in our federal system.
And that wasn't an isolated incident. That's happened with scientists from USDA and DOI too. And there is recourse, though. There are scientific integrity policies in each of these agencies. And each of these scientists can register a complaint. Now, they're internally deliberated, but there are
That's probably what they're doing.
I hope so.
Second part of the question.
And yes, the second part of the question, also rather naive, is I was wondering in listening to all the different areas of the scientific studies that the government handles, in this sort of scientific crisis, are there any very wealthy Buffett-like people that have an interest? Let's say I want to find out about the Inuit, I'm going to fund studies on this where the government cannot interfere on this. And I wondered if there were very wealthy ones that could just take one or two little projects and then they can publish their findings out to the public. Is there anybody doing that?
Look, Gates is doing that with very much, with really good funding on, they've actually come up with what they call a dry toilet to deal with cholera around the world. So yes, there are some very strong philanthropic efforts with some very wealthy people who are very thoughtful about the climate issue and other issues that are impacting the world.
But they don't necessarily replace,
No.
in many cases, what the government does, because most foundations, and I've worked with the foundation community for a long time now, and have been funded by foundations for some of my own research, they tend to want to do specific project work, but not the sort of long-term, regular data collection. They're not going to do the work that supports public health and safety protections like regulation. They're not going to do those kinds of efforts. They can be incredibly impactful in developing new systems, in funding areas that are more difficult to fund or are riskier to fund, or to something that the donors just happen to be interested in. Paul Allen is very interested in brain research, so has funded one of the founders of Microsoft, a huge amount of work on brain research. And now Bill Gates is going to do some work on Alzheimer's, and Gordon Moore has funded work, a lot of oceans work, but also in many other things like marine microbiology, which is sort of a cutting edge area, just because the family is interested in it. But that's different from what government does. And so it adds to the science process, but it's not a replacement for.
Joel, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I sometimes want to take it to another level with these private donors. I've been thinking about this lately. There are half a dozen villages in the coast of the Arctic, these Alaska Native villages, that absolutely need to relocate now. Amazon could relocate a village. Google could relocate a village, right? I mean, they could just try it and see how it goes. Of course, they need the cooperation from the federal government and those agencies, but I think that individual philanthropy can go a long way. Mike Bloomberg is showing us how to do that with his presence in Bonn and funding the creation of this giant climate action pavilion. So I think some of them are stepping up. We're seeing it, and it's invigorating, and I hope that they're setting a trend.
Some of that's potentially disorienting, though. For example, a large privately funded effort at geoengineering could experiment with the Earth's atmosphere for a few $1 billion, and it has been tried. In fact, it's been a strategy for some geoengineers to seek funding from multi-billionaires in order to circumvent government regulations and restraints.
Which should terrify you all if you're going to experiment with the Earth
And
on
that's
a
where
private basis.
we talked, I think one of the most serious concerns we raised was the U.S. pulling away from these international conversations, because dealing with that has to be an international conversation.
That's
Right.
Countries have to work together to deal with that dynamic. And I don't think we'll go to the meeting.
Well, Harvard's just received a $20 million grant to look into this,
Yeah, I know, it's
specifically
part of the
geoengineering.
conversation.
We had a long conversation in the Global Change Research Program about this. To what degree do federal agencies say or even hint that it's okay to even look at it, not to do it, but to find out where the hazards are, right? I mean, it's a very frightening, and you take very tentative steps in that direction, and they get blown out of proportion. So you have to be really careful talking about geoengineering and those kinds of solutions, because they may be creating bigger problems, of course, than they're meant to serve. Yeah.
Can I ask Joel a question, because you brought up the resilience question? One of the big worries I have, studying urban resilience and seeing the challenges, certainly in New England, which is going to be very challenged. This is an enormous task to adapt. And where is the federal government going to rise to that task? And we need to start doing that now. And I worry that these 4 years or 2 years we're going to lose, 3 years, whatever, is very critical, because a lot of people are starting to have the conversation. And it's a very difficult conversation with whether it's an Inuit village or it's a community, or I talked to a researcher about Rockaway, where Hurricane Sandy came across. Those folks still haven't come to terms with what the future of Rockaway is, which is basically it won't be there in within decades, probably. And it's just a hard conversation, and somehow the federal government has always been able to help that happen. And I'm worried that we don't have that engagement going, and that's a big challenge. That's a huge challenge.
It may be that the federal government does not lead. Hopefully the federal government will always provide some resources in this regard, but what we're seeing now are cities taking the lead, and they're doing a wonderful job with that, and a lot of that was showcased in Bonn too.
Good.
But you still see Puerto Rico is a really good example right now. I mean, there's a humanitarian crisis right now in Puerto Rico because the federal government, I would say, there are lots of other reasons, they were in a tough space before, but our federal government has not done what normally it could have done to help, and what it did in Houston and in Florida. So we're seeing examples of that now, and it's difficult to watch. So I hope that we bounce back after this interval of disregard for health and safety.
Mary.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking part, and this has been wonderfully informative.